The story of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, unfolds as a tale of human struggles, divine promises, and God's enduring grace. Ishmael's life is intertwined with themes of faith, human decisions, and God's providence, making his story one of deep significance in the Bible. Ishmael's birth, a product of human decisions. Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86 years old, at a time when he and his wife Sarah were grappling with God's promise of a child. In Genesis 15, God appeared to Abraham, assuring him that he would have a son and become the father of many nations. This promise seemed impossible as Sarah, then called Sarai, was unable to conceive. Faced with the apparent impossibility of bearing children, Sarah proposed a solution that was culturally acceptable at the time. She suggested that Abraham have a child with her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar. Genesis 16:3 recounts, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. In those times, it was common for a barren woman to offer her servant as a surrogate to bear children on her behalf. The child, born from such a union, would be legally regarded as the wife's child. This arrangement, though seemingly practical, set the stage for significant conflict. Hagar conceived, but her pregnancy caused tension between her and Sarah. Hagar began to look down on Sarah, leading to strife. Sarah, feeling wronged, turned to Abraham, saying, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judges between you and me." Genesis 16:5. Abraham allowed Sarah to handle the situation as she saw fit, leading Sarah to mistreat Hagar. In response, Hagar fled into the wilderness. This moment marked the beginning of a turbulent relationship between Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael. God's intervention and Ishmael's name. While in the wilderness, Hagar encountered an angel of the Lord, who instructed her to return to Sarah and submit to her. The angel also delivered a prophecy about her unborn son, saying, "You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." Genesis 16:11-12. The name Ishmael means God hears, signifying that God had heard Hagar's distress. This encounter underscored that Ishmael's birth was not a mistake or an accident, but part of God's plan. Despite the circumstances surrounding his conception, Ishmael was not forgotten by God. Ishmael and the covenant of circumcision. Years later, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, introducing the practice of circumcision as a sign of the covenant. This command applied to all male members of Abraham's household, including Ishmael. At the time, Abraham was 99 years old, and Ishmael was 13. Genesis 17:23 records that Abraham obeyed God's command, circumcising himself, Ishmael, and every male in his household. This act demonstrated that Ishmael was included in God's covenant with Abraham, though he was not the child of promise through whom the covenant's ultimate fulfillment would come. The covenant would be established through Isaac, the son God promised to Abraham and Sarah. Ishmael's role and God's promise. Although Ishmael was not the chosen heir of the covenant, God's promises to him were significant. When Abraham pleaded with God to bless Ishmael, God responded, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." Genesis 17:20. This promise ensured that Ishmael would play a vital role in history. Indeed, Ishmael became the father of 12 sons, who formed 12 tribes, laying the foundation for great nations. His descendants are traditionally associated with the Arab people, highlighting his lasting influence. Ishmael's departure from Abraham's household. The dynamics in Abraham's household changed dramatically after the birth of Isaac. Sarah, now miraculously bearing a son in her old age, saw Ishmael mocking Isaac during a feast. This incident, recorded in Genesis 21:9-10, prompted Sarah to demand that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. Sarah declared, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac." This request grieved Abraham deeply because Ishmael was his son. However, God instructed Abraham to heed Sarah's words, reassuring him that he would take care of Ishmael. Genesis 21:12-13 states, "Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed." Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away with provisions. They wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, where their water supply eventually ran out. Hagar, overcome with despair, placed Ishmael under a bush and wept at a distance, unwilling to watch her child die. God's provision in the wilderness. Once again, God intervened. An angel of the Lord called out to Hagar, saying, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." Genesis 21:17. God opened Hagar's eyes to see a well of water, providing for their immediate needs and renewing his promise to make Ishmael a great nation. This moment highlights God's faithfulness and care, even for those outside the covenant of promise. Ishmael's survival and the establishment of his lineage testify to God's ability to work through imperfect situations to fulfill his purposes. Ishmael's legacy. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness and became an archer. He settled in the region of Paran and married an Egyptian woman, establishing a family that would grow into a powerful nation. His descendants formed 12 tribes, fulfilling God's promise. Although Ishmael's story is often overshadowed by Isaac's, his life reflects God's compassion and the complexity of human relationships. Ishmael's name, meaning God hears, serves as a reminder that God is attentive to all, regardless of their circumstances. Lessons from Ishmael's story. Ishmael's life offers several important lessons for believers. First, his story demonstrates that God's promises are not limited by human mistakes. Although Ishmael's conception arose from a decision to take matters into human hands, God still had a plan for him. This reminds believers that God can bring purpose and blessing even out of flawed situations. Second, Ishmael's story highlights God's faithfulness and care for all people. Despite being outside the covenant of promise, Ishmael was not forgotten by God. His survival, growth, and the establishment of his descendants testify to God's provision and mercy. Finally, Ishmael's life underscores the importance of trusting God's timing and plan. Abraham and Sarah's attempt to fulfill God's promise through human means led to conflict and heartache. This serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of acting without waiting for God's guidance. Conclusion. The story of Ishmael is one of human struggles, divine intervention, and enduring grace. As Abraham's firstborn, Ishmael occupies a unique place in biblical history, illustrating how God's plans encompass even those who may seem forgotten or overlooked. His name, God hears, encapsulates the overarching message of his life. God is attentive to the cries of his people, providing for their needs and guiding their paths. As we reflect on Ishmael's story, may we be reminded of God's faithfulness, his ability to bring good out of difficult situations, and his care for all people. Ishmael's legacy is a testament to the depth of God's love and the breadth of his promises, encouraging us to trust him in all circumstances. Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, holds a significant place in biblical history, embodying themes of divine promises, human struggles, and God's enduring grace. Born when Abraham was 86 years old, Ishmael's birth was marked by complexity, as his arrival was the result of human intervention rather than divine timing. His story is intertwined with the lives of his father Abraham, his mother Hagar, and his stepmother Sarah, reflecting both the challenges of human decisions and the steadfastness of God's plans. The journey of Ishmael begins with God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 15. At this time, Abraham and Sarah were childless, and Sarah was unable to conceive. Despite God's assurance that Abraham would have numerous descendants, Sarah proposed a culturally accepted solution to their predicament. She offered her Egyptian maidservant Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate, a practice common in the ancient world. Genesis 16:3 records that Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to bear a child on her behalf. This arrangement, though pragmatic in their eyes, led to significant discord within the household. Hagar conceived and began to look down on Sarah, causing tension between the two women. When Hagar's attitude became unbearable, Sarah approached Abraham for support. Abraham, reluctant to intervene, allowed Sarah to handle the situation as she saw fit. Sarah mistreated Hagar, prompting the pregnant maidservant to flee into the wilderness. It was there that Hagar encountered the angel of the Lord, who comforted her and instructed her to return to Sarah. The angel revealed that the child she was carrying would be named Ishmael, meaning God hears, signifying that God had heard her distress. This encounter not only reassured Hagar, but also established Ishmael as a child under God's care, despite the circumstances of his conception. Ishmael's early life was marked by both inclusion and exclusion. As Abraham's only son at the time, Ishmael was circumcised at 13, along with his father and all the males in their household, as part of the covenant God established with Abraham. This act symbolized Ishmael's connection to God's promises, even though he was not the child of the covenant. The tension in Abraham's household escalated further with the miraculous birth of Isaac, the son God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. Isaac's arrival shifted the dynamics within the family, highlighting the divide between Sarah and Hagar and their respective sons. During a celebration for Isaac's weaning, Sarah observed Ishmael interacting with Isaac and perceived it as a threat. Genesis 21:9 describes Sarah's reaction, stating that she saw Ishmael scoffing. The exact meaning of this term is debated. Whether Ishmael was mocking, playing, or simply behaving in a way that upset Sarah, the outcome was the same. Sarah demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away, declaring, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac." Genesis 21:10. This demand deeply grieved Abraham, who loved Ishmael and had long regarded him as his heir. Abraham's reluctance to act reflects his attachment to Ishmael and his understanding of the customs of the time. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, children of maidservants were considered part of the household and had certain rights, even if they were not primary heirs. Expelling Hagar and Ishmael went against these norms. However, God reassured Abraham, instructing him to follow Sarah's wishes. God promised that while Isaac would be the child through whom the covenant would be fulfilled, Ishmael would also become the father of a great nation, because he was Abraham's offspring. Reluctantly, Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away, with provisions of bread and water. They wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba until their supplies were exhausted. Hagar, overcome with despair, placed Ishmael under a bush and sat at a distance, unable to bear watching him die. In this moment of desperation, God intervened once again. The angel of the Lord called to Hagar, reassuring her that God had heard Ishmael's cries. The angel reiterated God's promise that Ishmael would become a great nation. God opened Hagar's eyes to see a well of water, ensuring their survival and reaffirming his care for them. Ishmael's life in the wilderness marked the beginning of his independence from Abraham's household. He grew up to become an archer, a skill that likely contributed to his survival in the harsh environment. Ishmael settled in the region of Paran and married an Egyptian woman, establishing a family that would grow into a great nation. Genesis 25:12-18 records Ishmael's descendants, listing his 12 sons who became leaders of 12 tribes. This fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham regarding Ishmael underscores God's faithfulness and ability to work through all circumstances. The contrast between Ishmael and Isaac is a central theme in Ishmael's story. While Ishmael was born as a result of human effort and cultural customs, Isaac's birth was the result of God's direct intervention and promise. This distinction highlights the difference between human plans and divine will. God's covenant with Abraham was fulfilled through Isaac, but Ishmael's life and legacy demonstrate that God's blessings are not limited to one path. Ishmael's story offers several important lessons for believers. First, it illustrates that God's plans encompass even those born of human imperfection. Ishmael's conception arose from Abraham and Sarah's attempt to fulfill God's promise on their own terms, yet God still had a plan for him. Ishmael's name, God Hears, serves as a reminder of God's compassion and attentiveness to all, regardless of their circumstances. Second, Ishmael's life highlights the importance of trusting God's timing and plan. Abraham and Sarah's decision to involve Hagar introduced conflict and heartache, demonstrating the consequences of taking matters into one's own hands. Despite this, God's faithfulness prevailed, providing for Ishmael and ensuring his future. Finally, Ishmael's story underscores God's care for all people. Though he was not the child of the covenant, Ishmael was not forgotten. His survival in the wilderness and the establishment of his descendants testify to God's provision and mercy. In conclusion, the story of Ishmael is a narrative of human struggles, divine promises, and enduring grace. As Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael occupies a unique place in biblical history, reflecting the complexity of God's plans and the depth of his compassion. His name, God Hears, encapsulates the overarching message of his life, that God is attentive to the cries of his people, providing for their needs and guiding their paths. Ishmael's legacy as the father of 12 tribes and a great nation demonstrates that God's blessings extend beyond human limitations. His story challenges believers to trust in God's wisdom, wait on his timing, and recognize his care for all humanity. Through Ishmael's journey, we are reminded that God's grace is sufficient, his promises are sure, and his plans are always for the good of his creation. Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, played a significant role in biblical history. His story, intertwined with his mother Hagar and father Abraham, reflects God's providence, the fulfillment of promises, and the complexities of family relationships. Despite challenges surrounding his birth and life, Ishmael's legacy as a patriarch of 12 tribes and a great nation demonstrates God's ability to work through all circumstances. When Ishmael and Hagar were sent away into the wilderness by Abraham, they faced a dire situation. Their provisions of bread and water ran out, and they were on the brink of death from thirst. In desperation, Hagar placed Ishmael under a bush and sat at a distance, unwilling to watch her son die. At this critical moment, God intervened. He heard Ishmael's cries and reassured Hagar of his plans for her son. The angel of the Lord revealed a well of water, saving their lives. God promised that Ishmael, as Abraham's son, would become the father of a great nation, reflecting his faithfulness even in challenging circumstances. This promise was fulfilled as recorded in Genesis 25. Ishmael had 12 sons who became leaders of tribes forming a powerful nation. Ishmael settled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother Hagar, of Egyptian origin, selected an Egyptian wife for him. His descendants occupied regions from Havilah to Shur, near Egypt, extending toward Assyria. This territory, located in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, became home to the Ishmaelites. These people, known as Arabs, were often nomadic and are described as living in movable camps across the desert. Ishmael's sons, listed in Genesis 25:13-15, were Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. They became influential tribal leaders, paralleling the 12 sons of Jacob. Ishmael also had a daughter who later married Esau, Isaac's son, further connecting Ishmael's lineage to the broader narrative of Abraham's family. The Bible mentions descendants of Ishmael, such as Nebaioth and Kedar, in other passages, portraying them as skilled sheep breeders and prominent tribal families of their time. God's prediction about Ishmael's nature, made before his birth, came to fruition. In Genesis 16:12, God described Ishmael as a wild donkey of a man, whose hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. His descendants lived in hostility toward their neighbors, reflecting the fulfillment of this prophecy. Ishmael's tribal descendants were known for their independence and resilience, characteristics that defined their interactions with others. Although Isaac was the chosen heir through whom God's covenant with Abraham was fulfilled, Ishmael was not excluded from blessings. Genesis 25 indicates that Abraham gave gifts to Ishmael and his other sons by concubines, such as Keturah. These material blessings reflect Abraham's care for his children, even as Isaac held the primary role in continuing the covenantal promise. Notably, the relationship between Ishmael and Isaac was marked by reconciliation in adulthood. After Abraham's death, both sons are described as coming together to bury their father in the cave of Machpelah, as recorded in Genesis 25:9. This act suggests a resolution of earlier tensions and highlights their shared respect for their father's legacy. Ishmael lived 137 years, a significant lifespan by biblical standards. Although the Bible does not specify where he was buried, Islamic tradition places his tomb at the Kaaba in Mecca, underscoring his importance in both biblical and Islamic narratives. His descendants, often referred to as Ishmaelites, played a prominent role in the ancient Near East. They were known for their nomadic lifestyle, their involvement in trade, and their influence across the Arabian Peninsula. Ishmael's legacy extends beyond his immediate descendants. His life is a testament to God's faithfulness and ability to bring purpose from challenging circumstances. Despite being born outside the covenant promise made to Abraham and Sarah, Ishmael was not forgotten by God. His survival in the wilderness, the establishment of his tribes, and the fulfillment of God's promise to make him a great nation all demonstrate God's care and providence. The story of Ishmael also highlights the importance of trusting God's timing and plan. Abraham and Sarah's decision to have a child through Hagar, instead of waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled through Sarah, introduced significant conflict. However, God's faithfulness prevailed, providing for Ishmael and ensuring his future. This serves as a reminder to believers of the consequences of relying on human solutions rather than trusting in God's wisdom. Ishmael's story is also a narrative of reconciliation and shared purpose. Although tensions existed between Ishmael and Isaac in their youth, their act of burying Abraham together suggests a healing of their relationship. This moment reflects the broader theme of unity within Abraham's family, despite the divisions that arose from human decisions. In the New Testament, Ishmael's story is referenced in Galatians 4:22-31, where Paul uses him and Isaac as allegorical figures to illustrate the difference between living under the law and living under grace. Ishmael, born of Hagar, represents the old covenant of slavery, while Isaac, born of Sarah, symbolizes the new covenant of freedom through Christ. This interpretation underscores the theological significance of Ishmael's story, extending its relevance beyond its historical context. Ishmael's descendants, identified as Arabs in biblical and historical contexts, became a significant part of the ancient world. Their influence extended across regions, and their nomadic lifestyle shaped their interactions with neighboring peoples. The prophecy of Ishmael being a wild donkey of a man reflects both the independence and the conflicts that characterized his lineage. Ultimately, Ishmael's story is one of God's grace and faithfulness. Despite being born from a human attempt to fulfill God's promise, Ishmael was not forgotten or abandoned. His name, meaning God hears, serves as a reminder of God's attentiveness to the cries of his people. Ishmael's survival and the fulfillment of God's promises to him demonstrate that God's plans encompass even those who may seem outside the central narrative. In conclusion, Ishmael's life is a powerful reminder of God's providence and the complexities of human relationships. His journey from the wilderness to becoming the father of 12 tribes illustrates God's ability to bring blessings from challenging circumstances. Ishmael's story challenges believers to trust in God's timing, recognize His care for all people, and understand that His plans are always greater than human limitations. As Abraham's firstborn, Ishmael holds a unique place in biblical history, reflecting God's faithfulness and the enduring legacy of His promises. Ishmael is a prominent figure in biblical history, with his story carrying layers of spiritual, cultural, and historical significance. His life, while often overshadowed by Isaac's, reflects God's faithfulness, grace, and the complexities of human decisions in light of divine plans. Though not the child of the covenantal promise, Ishmael's narrative offers profound lessons about God's providence and the unfolding of salvation history. The Apostle Paul referenced Ishmael in his letter to the Galatians, using him as part of an allegory to contrast legalistic religious practices with the freedom found in Christ. In Galatians 4:21-31, Paul compares Ishmael, the son of the slave woman Hagar, with Isaac, the son of the free woman Sarah. Ishmael represents the Old Covenant, rooted in human effort and the law, while Isaac symbolizes the New Covenant, established through God's grace and promise. This analogy illustrates the fundamental spiritual truth of salvation. It is not achieved through human actions, but through faith in God's divine plan. Throughout Scripture, Ishmael's name reappears in different contexts, highlighting its commonality in biblical times. Notably, other individuals named Ishmael include a descendant of Saul and Jonathan, a high-ranking official under King Jehoshaphat, and a priest during Ezra's time. However, the most notable Ishmael outside Abraham's son was the son of Nethaniah, a member of David's royal lineage. This Ishmael played a pivotal role during the Babylonian oppression of Judah, where he assassinated Gedaliah, the governor appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah 41. Turning back to Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, his life story reveals a unique relationship with God. Although Ishmael was not the child of promise, God still chose his name, meaning God hears, and assured his greatness. God's care for Ishmael is evident when he saved him and Hagar in the wilderness, providing water and reiterating his promise that Ishmael would father a great nation. This divine intervention underscores God's attention to all his creation, regardless of their role in the covenant. Ishmael's lineage was structured into 12 tribal clans, mirroring Isaac's offspring. Genesis 25:12-18 lists Ishmael's 12 sons, who became tribal leaders, establishing Ishmael's descendants as a significant people group. These tribes, often associated with the northern Arabs, lived a nomadic lifestyle, fulfilling God's prophecy that Ishmael's descendants would be like a wild donkey of a man, Genesis 16:12, living independently and often in conflict with others, including the descendants of Isaac. Over time, Ishmael's descendants became intertwined with other groups, including the Midianites, who were also descendants of Abraham through Keturah, his second wife. This blending of peoples is evident in biblical passages that often associate Ishmaelites with Midianites. These interconnected lineages underscore the complexity of tribal relationships in the ancient Near East. Modern Arab identity often traces its roots to Ishmael, particularly within Islamic tradition. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, claimed direct descent from Ishmael, a belief central to many Muslim genealogies. The Quran emphasizes Ishmael's role as a patriarch of the Arab peoples, further solidifying this connection. While there is historical evidence linking Ishmael's descendants to the northern Arabs, it is unlikely that all Arab populations are solely descended from Ishmael. Other groups, including the descendants of Keturah and Esau, also settled in the Arabian Peninsula, contributing to the region's diverse ancestry. Missionary and author Kenneth Fleming supports the idea that Ishmaelites form a significant part of Arab ancestry. Ancient texts and genealogical studies corroborate connections between northern Arabs and Ishmael's descendants. However, it is essential to distinguish between the cultural significance of this lineage and the spiritual implications highlighted in the Bible. while Ishmael's story is integral to Arab identity. The Bible focuses on God's broader plan of salvation through Isaac's lineage, culminating in Jesus Christ. Despite the tension between Ishmael and Isaac, their shared heritage reflects God's blessings on both. Genesis 25 recounts Abraham's distribution of gifts to his sons by Hagar and Keturah, showing his care for them while affirming Isaac's role as the heir of the covenant. Ishmael and Isaac also demonstrated reconciliation later in life, coming together to bury their father, Abraham, at the cave of Machpelah, Genesis 25:9. This act of unity suggests that despite earlier conflicts, they honored their familial bond and shared respect for their father's legacy. Ishmael's story transcends his individual life, symbolizing natural birth and human effort. His birth from Hagar represents a reliance on human solutions rather than waiting for God's promise. In contrast, Isaac's birth to the barren Sarah at age 90 symbolizes God's supernatural intervention and fulfillment of His word. These two narratives highlight the tension between human actions and divine plans. Paul's use of Ishmael and Isaac in Galatians further illustrates this contrast. Hagar and Ishmael represent the Old Covenant, emphasizing the limitations of the law and human effort. Sarah and Isaac, on the other hand, embody the New Covenant, established through faith and grace. This allegory underscores the transformative power of the gospel, which frees believers from the constraints of the law and offers salvation through Christ. While Ishmael's descendants were not part of the covenant established through Isaac, they were not excluded from God's blessings. Ishmael's lineage prospered, becoming a great nation as God promised. Furthermore, the Bible teaches that all people, regardless of their ancestry, can share in Abraham's blessings through faith in Jesus Christ. Ishmael's story reminds us of God's inclusivity and the universal nature of His grace. Ishmael's legacy continues to influence history, culture, and faith. His descendants, identified as Ishmaelites, played a significant role in the ancient world, particularly in trade and tribal alliances. They were known for their resilience, independence, and adaptability, traits that define their interactions with neighboring peoples. Ishmael's name, meaning God hears, remains a powerful reminder of God's attentiveness and care for all people, regardless of their circumstances. In conclusion, Ishmael's story is more than a biographical account. It is a testament to God's faithfulness, the complexities of human relationships, and the unfolding of salvation history. His life reflects the tension between human effort and divine promise, highlighting the importance of trusting God's plans. Ishmael's legacy as a father of 12 tribes in a great nation demonstrates that God's blessings extend beyond covenantal boundaries, offering hope and purpose to all. Through Ishmael, we see that God's grace is not limited by human expectations, and His plans encompass the entirety of creation. Ishmael's story in the Bible reflects themes of human effort, divine grace, and God's faithfulness. Born to Abraham and Hagar through human attempts to fulfill God's promise, Ishmael represents natural birth and human striving. Despite not being the child of the covenant, Ishmael's name, meaning God hears, reflects God's attentiveness to his needs. After being sent away into the wilderness, Ishmael and Hagar faced near-death circumstances. God intervened, providing water and reiterating His promise that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness, became an archer, and fathered 12 sons, forming tribal leaders and fulfilling God's promise. The Apostle Paul used Ishmael and Isaac as allegories in Galatians, contrasting the old covenant of human effort, represented by Hagar and Ishmael, with the new covenant of grace, symbolized by Sarah and Isaac. This contrast illustrates the transformative power of the gospel and the freedom believers have in Christ. Although Ishmael's descendants lived a nomadic and often conflicted existence, God's blessings extended to them, demonstrating His care for all people. Ishmael's story teaches the importance of trusting God's timing, relying on His promises, and recognizing His faithfulness even in imperfect situations. His journey highlights God's ability to bring purpose and grace into every life, emphasizing that he hears and responds to the cries of his people.